This event with Reverend Brandan Robertson. His introduction will be forthcoming here in a second here. I just wanted to give you a couple of housekeeping details. Bathrooms are down the hallway to the left. There's 2 bathrooms. They're single user, so you go in, lock the door, and you're good to go. And then we've got some postcards that Jen's going to give you some events that we've got coming up that might be of interest to you, if this is interest to you tonight. So I just want to give a big thanks to Jen, who is our inclusion team leader and grant writer. Anyone wearing a black t-shirt with this is on that inclusion team, so if you have questions or they're fantastic human beings, so get to know them a little bit. They are, again, very passionate, and thank you for all of your efforts over the last year working on this very important message and topic. So thank you for that. So just kind of a format for tonight, what this is going to look like. You may have come with some questions. Some questions might come up as Brandan is speaking. We're going to do a Q&A following Brandan's presentation. So after Jen introduces him, he's going to speak for a bit, and then Gina Fories. Gina, raise your hand. Gina Fories is on our council, and she and Brandan are going to sit on these stools and just field your questions and have a conversation that we get to just be fly on the wall and listen in on as we do that. So that's kind of the format, and then we'll have kind of an informal time afterwards where you can come talk to Brandan, and we'll kind of be hanging out there. There's chocolates and water and coffee in the back as well. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jen Steele to take us from here.
Good evening. I am delighted that you all are here. This has been several months in the making, and so super excited to have everyone here. PK talked a little bit about the postcards. On the postcards, there's a lot of amazing information. A couple things to highlight is not just tonight, but we are going to be blessed with Brandan joining us for service tomorrow morning, and then starting on Wednesday, we're going to have Austin Harkey joining us for our Lenten adventures, shall we say, on Wednesday nights at 6:30. So you guys are all welcome to join us for that as well. And then you'll notice at the bottom of the card that one of the other things that was coming out of this grant that we wrote is there'll be some upcoming scholarship opportunities exemplifying inclusivity and the LGBTQIA+ advocacy for college students ages 18 to 22. So that process will be rolling out here shortly, just so that we can give everyone time to do that. Now, I get the honor to introduce Brandan, and so I dug really deep, and at the bottom of my grocery list I have written, so I'm going to read it because it's very important. Welcome. As part of the Gleaning from Harvest grant, we are pleased to have a celebrity in our midst. Yeah. Our speaker tonight is a very, very important person who gave me one sentence to announce him, and I took liberties with that. He has lots and lots of amazing accolades and is apparently very modest, so I'll only name a few. Brandan Robertson was named by the Human Rights Campaign as one of the top faith leaders leading the fight for the LGBTQ equality. He's a founding member of a variety of organizations and topics related to tonight's presentation. In 2021, Rolling Stone magazine included Brandan in its annual hot list of top artists, creatives, and influencers who are giving us a reason to be excited about the future. He is an author. He did not request this plug, but this is his book. It's for sale out there. He did not ask me to do that. And most importantly, him and I share a birthday. So, people of all pronouns, faith, and communities, I present to you Brandan Robertson.
Well, good evening, St. Luke. It is so good to finally be here. You probably know we scheduled this in October, and then I got COVID 2 days before I was supposed to come. So I'm really glad that we were able to make it work now. And it is really an honor to be here tonight talking about a topic that your community is so clearly so invested in, and that is how to become truly inclusive. So I'll start with a little bit of a story. It's just our hope that you don't leave here and start waving rainbow flags. Those were the words spoken to me by the dean of my Bible college during my senior year. I'd been called into a meeting with the dean and with my choir director the first day of classes after a professor had seen a picture of me on the internet hanging out with some progressive Lutheran clergy. You might know her, Nadia Bolz-Weber. And they circulated that picture around the faculty because they were worried about the company I was keeping and where it might mean my theology was heading. You see, for a majority of Christians around the world, to be inclusive and embracing of LGBT people is to abandon true Christianity. This is certainly still the case in many conservative evangelical movements, the movement my Bible college was a part of, which churn out thousands of students every year across this country that lead the church in a fight against the culture that's growing more and more accepting of diverse identities. Beyond the exclusively evangelical fundamentalist denominations, there are many more denominations that are using the language of welcoming, even when it comes to LGBT people, but still retain a homophobic undercurrent that when it comes to LGBT individuals, from when they try to become members of churches or when they try to participate or be ordained. And of course, there are many denominations that have led the fight for the full inclusion of LGBT people, led by brave saints like my friend and mentor, Bishop Gene Robinson of the Episcopal Church, or Bishop Karen Oliveto of the United Methodist Church, and many others in all of our mainline denominations that have been making progress for LGBT inclusion. These denominations and communities march in pride parades, proudly display rainbow flags in front of the church, and use gender-inclusive language in their hymns and in their scripture readings. They're really deeply inclusive. But what I want to ask you tonight, and the challenge I want to bring tonight is that really enough? Are these outward signs of inclusion in some of our more inclusive communities really the logical end of what it means to be an inclusive follower of Jesus? We're in a period of unprecedented change in the church and in society, one that has never happened in church history or in human history before. The question we must answer is, what does it mean for us to embrace inclusion as a society? And for us tonight, more specifically, what does it mean as followers of Jesus for us to create inclusive communities of faith? At some level, the answer might seem simple. I want to suggest that to be truly inclusive presents a much larger challenge to the church and society as a whole, one that I believe, if we're going to be faithful followers of Jesus, we must be willing to embrace. For the past 8 years, you've heard a little bit about this, I've had the opportunity to work with faith leaders and community leaders and political leaders and see the seeds of this growing reformation and revival for LGBT inclusion. Whether it was sitting with Southern Baptist leaders who are wrestling with their own denomination's anti-LGBT stance and how to become more loving towards the queer community, or sitting on panels with the U.S. State Department, which is now trying to combat the export of homophobic theology to places like Malawi and Rwanda from American evangelicals. I've gotten to hear every side of this discussion. And as I've worked on this issue from a theological, sociological, and political perspective, I, like so many others, discovered that the way we've been seeking to address inclusion has been gravely deficient. That change that I'd been advocating for over the past 8 years, I learned that some of the ways that I was advocating for were short-sighted. See, I discovered that there's a real difference between being a community who center on the inclusion of LGBT people and being a community that centers on the inclusion of all people, which is the call for all of us who claim to follow Christ. And I've also discovered that the way in which we've sought to include marginalized people as churches has often been deficient at best and harmful at worst. And so this is the discussion I want to invite us into this evening. And I'd like to invite us into the tensions of examining our individual attitudes and our collective attitudes on what it means to be truly inclusive. So back to that meeting with the dean. I walked out of his office feeling utterly afraid. I had been shamed and threatened with expulsion should I change my theology or social views, even one iota towards inclusion, while I was still a student. And I was assured that if I changed after I graduated, I would be labeled a false teacher and a heretic by the defenders of orthodoxy. At the time, I didn't know what to believe. All I knew was that I was wrestling with my own sexual identity. I knew that I had tried to follow the teachings of my faith. I prayed to God. I'd even gone through conversion therapy, and nothing seemed to have worked. And yet, for all my faithfulness, my community was still responding to me with fear, saying that if I even asked the question, I was standing on the side of the enemy. During this season, I found a small church just a few blocks from my school that identified as deeply Christian and deeply inclusive. They welcomed LGBT people. And for the first time, I saw a community that leaned into the gospel imperative to love people just as they were. And since finding that small church in Chicago that challenged me and spoke words of healing to my fear-filled spirit, I've become committed to a preaching of a gospel of radical inclusion. And I've become convinced that the church, for the past 1,500 years at least, has set aside the true gospel and its radical implications, instead for a gospel of privilege and power. You see, I believe inclusion is the burning heart of the gospel. Yet what's stunning is that throughout the history of the Christian movement, many, if not most, Christian sects have abandoned the inclusion imperative that Jesus embodied and embraced this diluted gospel message that limits the scope and the power of Jesus Christ in the world. This is because when one embraces the radical inclusion of the gospel, we're forced to do the hardest thing that any humans could ever do: confront our own ego, our own privilege, sacrificing it for the good of our neighbors, our friends, and even those we're afraid of, those we might perceive as enemies. To follow this call is the most difficult thing to do, and yet it's at the heart of what it means to follow Jesus. This is why Jesus said the path is narrow, and those who walk on it are few. This wasn't a pronouncement of God's exclusion or the exclusivity of God's saving work. Far from it. It was a declaration of just how difficult it is to comprehend, let alone follow, the path of Jesus' inclusion. The opposing road, the road of violence, selfishness, exclusion, oppression, this is the road that is broad and many walk on it. This is why societies around the world are far more likely to form power structures that favor one class, one race, one gender, one religion, and exclude and marginalize others. It's easier to build communities of exclusion than it is ones of inclusion. The rich get richer, the powerful are more empowered, and those born on the lowest rungs of the social ladder are told that they can do nothing to change the way the things are. That is, until that radical renegade rabbi from Nazareth comes and starts preaching good news to the poor, liberation to the oppressed, and God's grace for all. When the grace of Christ unmasks the systems and structures of the world and reveals that they are false constructions, sustained only by myths and lies about the way the world truly works, those on the margins get empowered and are energized to begin tearing down the systems and working for a society and a world where all can stand equal together. As children of God, filled with the same loving spirit of Jesus. If this message of liberation and inclusion is truly the heart of the gospel, what does it mean for communities of faith that organize around this good news and example of Jesus? How are we to participate in this narrow road of radical inclusion? We know that Jesus empowered the poor, the criminal, the minority, the irreligious, and the unclean. He called everybody to repentance, to stop walking in the ways that lead to death through separation, marginalization, and exclusion, and to begin walking in the rhythm of the kingdom of God, the truest shape of reality that has consistently been suppressed by our own propensity to detest diversity, difference, and to value conformity. When the veil of deception is removed and the truth can be seen clearly, what is to stop those who have been kept low from rising up and toppling the ungodly systems of this world? And likewise, what is to stop those who are at the top with the most power and privilege from subconsciously working to keep the systems of privilege in place that gives them their power and their status? If the message of Jesus' gospel is true, that a new way of seeing and being in the world is being manifest on earth as it is in heaven, that the truth of God's love and grace and forgiveness and delight in all of creation is being pulled up from our collective subconscious mind and embraced as the most fundamental truth of the gospel, then we must necessarily transform the ways we live in the world. A death must occur, a death of our ego, of our fleshly desires, which prefer to uplift those who look like us, act like us, love like us, and vote like us. A sacrifice must take place, not of animals, not religious sacrifices, but rather sacrificing our own privilege and comfort and power. We as Christians are called to lay our lives on the altar of sacrifice, not to appease an angry God, but to demonstrate to our neighbors that we love them, that God loves them, and that we will not act for our own self-interest, but for the collective good of all of us together. This message of inclusion, I believe, is the burning heart of the gospel, and it's the cornerstone of the Christian faith. If we who bear the name of Christ are going to follow the Jesus who crossed every boundary in order to bring back the most wayward sheep, we must be willing to follow that example as well. Going out of the four walls of our churches, finding those who are excluded and bringing them in. Because all people are made in the image and likeness of God. All people are our siblings, sharing in the same spirit and life that pulsates through all things. If we're willing to accept this truth, then we can truly bear the name of Christ and be confident in calling ourselves Christians. Which brings me to the big point. In order to understand this need for inclusion, we must understand the impact of exclusion. All of us here tonight have been excluded from something at some point in our lives. Upon realizing we weren't invited to an event where the rest of our friends were, or being blatantly told that we're not welcomed to participate in some group activity, all of us have felt that shame, that sense of being pushed to the side. Shame that we're not good enough. Shame that we've done something wrong, or worse, that we are something wrong. We question who we are, our place in our friend group or our community, and sometimes we question our fundamental worth. To be purposefully excluded is one of the deepest pains a human can experience because we are fundamentally wired for community, for our families, for our tribes. This is how we begin to develop an individual sense of self through relationships to others. And inclusion in community is a fundamental psychological need. As Brene Brown puts it, a deep sense of loving and belonging is an irreducible need of all people. If that's true, then it follows that communities that reject people are going against a fundamental part of what it means to be a human being. They are assaulting the fundamental ordering of creation, generated by the very essence of God. So it can't be overstated then from a Christian perspective that to exclude a person from relationship or from a community, to tell somebody that they can't be in relationship with God because of who they are, is perhaps the most blasphemous and destructive sin that we could commit. To isolate another human being is to cut them off from the relationships that are fundamental to what it means to be a human. It's a degradation of their humanity. Isn't it ironic then that those who have been commissioned with the gospel of inclusion have most often been the people perpetuating exclusion in our world? Throughout our 2,000-year history, Christians time and time again have fallen into the trap of thinking and declaring who is in and who is out. And we have ample psychological data that shows whenever we do that as religious institutions, we cause psychological harm, not just to LGBT people, but to any community that we exclude. Discrimination, exclusion, it's all rooted in our own unhealed wounds or prejudice. When we discriminate or exclude, it's often because we've believed false narratives and we put blame on other people for things that aren't actually true about them. Unsurprisingly, the LGBT community is often one of the major scapegoats, not just for Christians, but for society as a whole. When any community is excluded from society or the church, it's because we've bought into a scapegoating narrative that dehumanizes both the excluded and the excluders. When we exclude, we reveal that our true motivations are coming from a place of fear. And when we're afraid, we revert to lower levels of consciousness. And instead of working from love, we act from animalistic instincts. But we all know the verse from the Bible that is the foundation of my entire faith. God is love, and love casts out all fear. When we're truly connected to God, when we're functioning in love, there is no room for us to be afraid of others whom we don't understand. When we function from love, we are brought together. We commit to do life with one another, with those who are different, with those who challenge us, with those who previously we might have been afraid of because we didn't understand. But love asks us to sit and to listen and to learn and to look for the face of God in the different people that surround us. Now, this work, it's not easy. It's not a one-time process. This is something our denominations often do, right? They walk churches through an inclusion process and declare you're now inclusive. But to be truly inclusive is an ongoing posture of life. We must always be asking who is not being welcomed in our space, whose voice is missing, what perspectives aren't we hearing? And the reason we do that is because we believe that when people in all of our diversity are not represented, we are missing something. To be conformed to the image of Christ is to be reformed and refined into the image of the second Adam, as the Apostle Paul puts it. And the word Adam in Hebrew simply means human. In Christ, all of our walls are torn down. And we're united across all of the boundaries and the borders that we falsely erect as humans. The Apostle Paul says the goal of Christ is to create one new humanity. One new humanity. The stunning reality, friends, of embracing true inclusion is that it's not just a justice mission to reach out to those on the margins. When we actually embrace true inclusion, when we set our minds and our missions towards going out to the highways and byways and finding those whose voices aren't being heard, we become liberated. We begin to heal. We begin to learn and be enriched. Inclusion is a blessing not just for the marginalized, but from those with the power and the privilege, the gatekeepers. The truth is that the process of becoming LGBT affirming, or for your community to become focused on racial justice, or just about any other issue of justice or equality for marginalized people, often causes the community to rethink other aspects of our theology, doesn't it? Because as marginalized perspectives are added to the tapestry of our faith community, we're challenged to see through their eyes and to see with their nuances. I've worked with dozens of communities that started off as non-inclusive, and they wanted to go through a process towards LGBT inclusion. And yet, they tried to hold on to rigid traditionalist theology. And often there's a great tension and dissonance that arises in that congregation, because by integrating minority perspectives into a community, you're also necessarily opening up your community to rethinking what it means to have faith altogether. You're inviting your community to see from another side, to consider a different point of view. And most of us know that we're drawn to inclusive communities not only because they include the marginalized, but because they're safe spaces for us too, to embrace different theologies or beliefs, to deconstruct and to reconstruct with different theological paradigms. You see, the call to be truly inclusive is a call to embrace not just marginalized people, but a broad diversity of perspectives and human thoughts, with all of their colors and complexity and diversity. When you begin to open your door to include marginalized groups, you're also opening it up to many different perspectives as well. And you should be prepared to become a community that embraces questions, doubts, the ability to listen for what the Spirit of God might be saying and calling your community towards, even if it challenges your traditional beliefs and practices. The more diverse our communities seek to become, the more we embrace those on the margins, the more we will reflect the image and likeness of our diverse God. But likewise, the more diverse our communities become, the less control we're going to have over what people believe, how they act. But come to think of it, that's never been what the role of the church was meant to be anyways. Instead, the church is meant to be a community where all of our diversity is at once celebrated and de-emphasized, where we seek unity that's deeper than skin or sexuality or gender or theology, a deep, expansive spiritual union with God, with our world, and with each other. To be truly inclusive is to welcome the messiness of human perspectives and to give up our hope of having certainty or a community that conforms to any set of beliefs in exchange for more robust communities that are united in values, but are wildly diverse in our expression of our faith. When you open the door to true inclusion, it will always lead to far more folks stepping out of their fear-based chambers and into the freedom of being able to be who they are. And that's the most beautiful reality. Inclusive communities become safe havens, not just for the marginalized, but for those who are leaving behind rigid theological communities, those who have been marginalized, those who have never felt like they fit in. They become places where a lot of broken people with a lot of work to do show up and seek to be involved and empowered. This is often the opposite of what happens in belief-restricted or exclusive communities. Walk into any evangelical megachurch around, and I guarantee that what you'll find are a couple thousand people with similar skin color, similar income levels, similar political affiliations, and the same similar worldview. You'll find people who are comfortable and who see their church as an extension of their culture and their community that they generally live in. Very few people will be greatly challenged in those communities to see a different perspective. And if you do bring a different perspective in those communities, it's quickly refuted. These sterile communities can look great. They're comfortable and appealing to our human nature. But they send a clear message. Unless you have your stuff together, unless you align with us, you can't actually belong here. On the flip side, if you commit to being a community that embraces true inclusion, and you become a place where people from all walks of life are truly welcomed and not being forced to conform, but rather they come and are seeking to be empowered to be their true selves, you're going to find your community gets much more complex, much more messy, much harder to manage. But again, the church was never meant to be a conformity institution. It was never meant to be a neat institution. It was meant to be a robust family where we challenge each other, where we are forced to expand our minds, where we're forced to take on new perspectives. The folks who come into an inclusive community might not be interested in your Sunday service or your Wednesday Bible study, but they might want to connect or bring their own spiritual practice in new ways, whether that's a yoga class or meditation groups or discussion circles at your local pub. Truly inclusive communities measure their success not by how many people fill the pews on Sunday mornings or those who have entered through your discipleship or membership process, but by people engaged in various ways throughout the week with various manifestations of what your community can look like. What I want to challenge us just very briefly tonight is this, that if we're going to embrace true inclusion, it's got to be more than just a process of becoming LGBT inclusive. We've got to be willing to rethink what it means to be a church community at all. We've got to rethink what it means to be a Christian at all. It's not about conforming to beliefs or doctrines or joining institutions. It's about inviting people and creating space and allowing all of the diverse manifestations of God through diverse peoples to have the space to flourish and to allow us to be challenged and made uncomfortable by that. And as I look at your community and communities all around the world, it's undeniable that the Spirit of God is up to something. And all of us have a choice. We can either join in the flow of the kingdom of God and be swept in the mighty current towards greater beauty and expansiveness, which will require us to rethink what it looks like to be church, to be Christians, or we can resist the flow of God's Spirit and oppose this movement of liberation. So that even the numbers right now that show Christianity is dying, there are other numbers that are suggesting something really strange is happening. That more and more people are showing up from the margins in Christian churches. More and more folks are identifying with Christianity and not joining institutions. Something's happening right now in Christianity that's not the death of the way of Jesus, but a rebirth of the way of Jesus. And to be a part of it, it's going to require us to embrace the gospel of inclusion that causes us to rethink everything we know about what it means to be Christian, to be church, what it means to create communities of faith. I believe that what's happening right now is not the death of Christianity, but the death of a version of Christianity that is patriarchal, heteronormative, racist, sexist. And once those structures begin to fall, new manifestations of community will begin to manifest. Christianity isn't dying, but the sinful systems of oppression that it has perpetuated for 2,000 years are being dismantled. And maybe minorities, sexual and gender minorities and racial minorities and those with different abilities and disabilities, maybe they have something to teach the church. Maybe it's time we uplift those voices, not being a voice for the voiceless, but giving the voiceless back their voice. What if we as communities stop trying to speak on behalf of those we're advocating for and instead give platform and space for those who have a voice to share their voice? What if we listened and learned and were shaped by them? Friends, I believe God is up to something. And while many of those who have held power and privilege for so long will continue to resist, to call this movement of inclusion an abomination or antichrist, this reformation will continue onward. You're good Lutherans here, so you know one of the battle cries of the Reformation is reformed and always reforming. If we're going to lay claim to this movement, we must lay claim to the radicalness of that statement. Those who resist will not be able to stop this river of justice and revival. So may those of us here tonight who've been excluded, may we step boldly into our place at the table of God's grace. May the systems of oppression and conformity in our churches, in our denominations, in our societies be dismantled for good. May our communities strain to be truly inclusive by listening to the voices that have been marginalized and being willing to rethink, reform, and renew what it looks like to be a community of faith, rejecting the desire to stop where we're comfortable and continue to press forward towards expanding the gates of the kingdom of God to more and more people. For only in our broad and messy diversity do we truly reflect the divinity of our God. Amen? Now, let's chat. Thank you. spill water everywhere. Sorry.
Mic check. We working?
Testing, testing.
All right. Whew. Okay. I just need a minute. I feel like I was holding my breath while you were talking.
Deep breaths.
Like, whoa, this is a lot coming at me all at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for giving us that part of you. I feel like we're going to call this section of the night the Oprah section because I've decided I'm going to channel Oprah here as I'm interviewing you.
Love it.
Okay. So, to maybe just kick us off with a lighter question, we'll go deep quick. But do you have a favorite definition of inclusion?
That's a hard question. I probably defined it 50 different ways over the years. But I really do think inclusion is simply kind of what I just harped on for 20 minutes, is opening up our boundaries, personal, communal boundaries. And there's one line that I use, and I keep repeating it. It's giving the voiceless back their voice. It's not speaking up on behalf of people. It's not even doing your homework and reading about people's perspectives. It's actually listening, sitting at the feet of those who have been pushed to the margins and learning what the world looks like from their perspective. And as you digest that, you will naturally be changed. The way your community holds itself will be changed. And so I just challenge the idea of inclusion being like a process or being something you can do one time. Instead, it's a posture of always listening, being self-aware as community, saying who isn't being heard, and finding where they're speaking. And if they don't have a place to speak, giving platform to people that are marginalized and allowing their voices to transform us. And so that is not a concise definition, but there you go.
I like it. I heard you say your definition is giving voice, opening up and giving voice to the voiceless.
Yes,
okay,
perfect.
Let's call it that.
Love it.
All right, thank you. All right, so another thing you said, talking about how exclusive communities really find their power in that exclusion.
Yeah.
I believe I said something under my breath, and Kate as well, when you said that, like, dang it.
Yeah.
So where's our power as a community of inclusion? Where do inclusive communities find their power?
Yeah. It's a good question. So in the book True Inclusion, one of the things I start off with is saying, if you're going to become a truly inclusive community, give up your hope of seeing this auditorium packed ever again. That was really hard. I wrote this book while I was in my first pastorate, and I told my church, we're not going to grow like the mega church down the road, because being truly inclusive means that you're going to welcome people in on different places of their journey. They're going to stop in, they're going to get healed, and they're going to move on. Because the institution is no longer, the institution cannot hold inclusion, right? Inclusion goes beyond getting people to join a community. And so, as a community, to find your power in being inclusive, you have to change your frame. You're not trying to grow Sunday services anymore, speaking from a church perspective. Instead, you're trying to be of service to the most people and for yourself to be transformed. There is a healthy selfishness here too. And I tried to highlight that is when you're inclusive, you grow. You become enriched. You become a more well-rounded person. And you're liberated from all of the conformity that all of us have been subjected to. Everybody has fit into molds and put on masks. And so when we come into proximity with marginalized people, we're empowered to take those masks off ourselves and to start expressing ourselves in its fullness. And so, again, it's hard to have concise answers to some of these questions, but I think the power of inclusion is to know that you're going to be a community, as a church, you're going to be a community that many people come through. I call it a revolving door community. They're going to keep coming through. People are going to keep coming in. Your posture, your calling, is to be a waypoint along people's journey towards wholeness and healing. And that's a fundamental shift for churches, for pastors, for communities, because it used to be communities of exclusion are all about come and join us, and that's it. You're here, the door's closed, you're a part of us. That's not what we're called to do. And if you read the Gospels, that's not how Jesus treated his disciples. There was always a freedom. Come or go as you please. Some people will stick around and stay. Amazing. But that's not how we're finding our identity anymore if we're going to become a truly inclusive community, if that makes sense.
Yes, and I like how you maybe how I would sum up it would be, we're not a church with a whole bunch of people attending service, but
Right.
we are a community that is of service to the most people. We don't have the most people at our service, but we are of service to the most people.
We got a
Can someone
preacher
write
up
that
here.
down?
Goodness gracious.
Okay, very good.
I love it.
All right. I think you just answered that question. How about this? Is there a wrong way to be an inclusive church?
Yeah.
Good, I'm glad.
So
I'm
many
glad to
wrong
hear.
ways. Well, and I try to tread lightly on this, but I started off there in my talk, and I start there in the book. It's a lot of well-meaning progressive churches do all of the external things to signify inclusion. Rainbow flags and Black Lives Matter posters out front, and there's a place for that, and that's good. But if you're not actually willing to engage with those communities, if it is performative, that's not inclusion. If you have a Black Lives Matter sign out front of your church, but there aren't Black voices included in your community, then is that, what's the usefulness of that? If there's a rainbow flag outside of your church, but there isn't a platform in your community for LGBT folks, and when an LGBT tragedy happens in your community, your folks aren't showing up for that, are you inclusive? And this is my big critique of our progressive denominations these days, is we have processes. In the Disciples of Christ that I was formerly a pastor in, it was called like the inclusive church process, and it was literally you go through like a 6-week thing, you get a little thing to put on your church door, and you're labeled an inclusive community on a website, and it's like, no, you've just taught churches how to use some right language, that's nice, but I'm actually really afraid if an LGBT person shows up to that community because they've not done the work to listen and learn. And so I would just say, that's what I really mean by inclusion versus true inclusion. The external symbols matter. Many of you, if you're an LGBT person in this room, know that like you'll look on our church's website for a little rainbow flag. Like that's a sign that that's a safe place. But it doesn't actually mean it's safe. There needs to be the work happening in the community, on the ground, and that's the ally's job, right? If you're an ally to any of the communities you're trying to stand up for, whether it's those experiencing homelessness, the LGBT community, those with disabilities, always be in conversation with how can we learn from them, how can we empower them, how can we serve them? And I think that's a much harder process. It's a big investment. It takes a lot of time and energy. It's a lifetime commitment. But as I said, that's why Jesus said the path is narrow and few walk on it, because this wasn't an easy path that we agreed to follow when we decided to follow Jesus.
Well said, thank you. Okay, so here's another question that I think a lot of us here that attend St. Luke regularly, I've talked to some people here about this, is how do, and maybe this is, I'm going to make sure I word this right, how do maybe people that have closed minds, that haven't opened up yet, that maybe they're a little curious or they don't want to leave, but they're just, they don't really want to change,
Yeah.
where do they fit into a culture of inclusion? So it seems like almost like there's a paradox in there somewhere.
There is.
Yeah. What do you think about that?
So this is where stuff gets hard, but I'll speak the truth. When your community commits to inclusion, I remember sitting in an elders meeting at my church when I came to this realization, that we cannot include the exclusive if you're going to be an inclusive community. That's a really hard thing to sit with. There's a guy named Karl Popper, I believe, is a philosopher who calls it the paradox of inclusion. And it's, if you're going to commit to be radically inclusive, there are going to be some people that are not willing to go there. It's not our job to shame them. There are a lot of folks that just have not had the life experience or live in a community where they're not exposed to a ton of diversity and don't see the pressing need. We can try to educate and nudge people in a direction, but at some point when we commit to be inclusive people or inclusive families or inclusive churches, there are going to be people that just say, I'm out. I don't get it. And I think the mistake a lot of communities make is that we turn towards shame and guilt And that furthers those people into deeper exclusion. As a revolving door community, we need to say, if this isn't for you, there are 100 other churches surrounding us right now that are not doing what we're doing, and you can go be comfortable there. Go in peace. But if you want to stick around, we're going to welcome you. We're going to allow, this is hard too, allow people who don't have our evolved progressive perspectives to share their opinions when it makes us cringe and uncomfortable, and to hold space for those conversations too. I think being inclusive means that we allow for that to exist as well. And so it's that tension of saying, this is where we're going as a community. You're welcome to come with us. You're welcome to learn with us. And if there ever comes a point where you're not with us on this journey anymore, we're not going to guilt you to stay here. It's not wrong for you to go to a different place. And I think I talk about this in counseling one-on-one most of the time, of people that deal with like exclusive parents, if you're an LGBT person. The way you're going to change their heart and mind is not by demanding that they come and listen to your inclusive version of Christianity, not by calling them bigots. It's going to be by living your life as an LGBT person or as an inclusive person, and them seeing something in you that compels them, seeing the compassion in you that compels them to say, let me learn more on my own. And that's where hearts and minds change. And so, again, more paradox around this, but yeah.
Thank you. You answered my last question. So that means I get to open it up to the floor. So I'm going to walk around with the microphone. If you have a question, I can bring it to you. Don't be afraid. Any questions for Brandon?
Yeah.
This is not related at all, but is Culver's just a Midwest thing?
I think it is.
Okay.
Is Culver's just a Midwest thing? Yes. I've had it before, but it's definitely not on the East Coast. And there might have been one in California when I lived there.
I think it's a Wisconsin thing.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. That's why it's a Butterburger. Mm-hmm. All right.
Yes.
Do you travel a lot because you want to see other people's opinions?
It's a great question. Yes. I grew up in a family that didn't travel at all. And so when I got to college, I joined a choir, and we traveled the world. And for the first time, we started going around to different countries. And I got to see, the way I put it, see God working in different places and in different people that I never knew God was working in. And I think I'm more inclusive today because of all the experiences I've gotten to have sitting with different people all around the country and around the world. So if you're blessed enough and have the privilege of traveling, do it. Go listen and learn and sit at the feet of other people and learn their perspectives. It's a great question. Thank you.
As you think about the journey you've been on, would you do anything differently if you could do it again?
I would do so much differently. Yes and no. This is always a hard question for all of us, right? Part of me wonders what my life would have looked like if I didn't spend 4 years in a fundamentalist Bible college that demanded I go through conversion therapy and all of that fun stuff. And then part of me is really cautiously grateful for that experience as well, because it helps me. I feel like my primary calling today is as a missionary to evangelicals. So I actually spend more of my time not talking to progressive communities, but talking to very conservative folks, because I know their language and I know their culture and I can speak to them. And so I'm grateful for that. But I do think that I was just so, and I feel like so many people are so, progressive, inclusive Christians have bad marketing. And so many people don't know that communities like yours exist. And I really do wish I would have done a little bit more research early on in my journey. And I really wish some progressive communities would have marketed a little bit better early on in my journey, because we can save people so much pain, so much trauma, so many people walking away from faith altogether needlessly. It's the number one comment that makes me feel great, but it's sad on my TikTok, is if I had a pastor like you, I would have stayed in church. It's like, I'm not new. Our denominations, your denomination, have been doing this for 40 years. So, yes, I wish I would have found an inclusive community earlier, and I'm grateful for the experiences nonetheless. Yeah.
It's kind of bridging to my question. How do we go from, I feel like I personally at least am at the transition point of trying not to do just the external
Yeah.
stuff that you're talking about. How do I help myself connect with other people in that way that's going to be able to not pull them in like you're saying, but
Yeah.
how do I help them even know that this exists?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a twofold path. I do think there's utility in all of us who are identified as progressive Christians who belong to a church. Like, be vocal about that. You all have some version of social media, I presume. Say something once in a while when you go to church. Like, talk about your community. Let other people know. It changes and saves lives. I didn't go into the statistics in my talk, but I had them listed of literally the rates of mental illness and suicidality go through the roof if you're an LGBT person in a faith community that preaches non-affirming theology. Just you sharing on your Facebook or your Instagram or in an email that you go to an inclusive church or your church is celebrating Pride this Sunday or whatever could send a signal to somebody that they don't have to go sit at XYZ church down the road and hear what they're going to hear. The other side of it is, one story I tell all the time, one of the most remarkable ministers early on in the journey for me was a guy named Pastor Danny Cortez. He's in La Mirada, California, Southern Baptist pastor. Son came out as gay, and he wanted to learn how to do this, whatever this is, how to be a better parent and a better pastor. And so he started writing his sermons in West Hollywood, which is the gay neighborhood of Los Angeles. Just sit in a coffee shop and be around a community that he didn't know anything about, and would strike up conversations, not there to invite them to church, not there to convert anybody, was there to make friends and to listen. And what I would challenge people, it takes a lot for us to do this, I understand, but if there's a community you want to be a part of, don't go necessarily asking them to educate you, but go be in their midst. That's the model of Jesus, by the way. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. The model is go to the place you want to learn. Immerse yourself in those people. Make friends. It's uncomfortable. But goodness gracious, when you do it, you will be transformed, and it's the best education you can get. So there's not a quick and easy path to here's the 5 things you need to do to be inclusive, but just be around the people you want to learn about. And I think through those relationships and through osmosis of being in the midst of those communities, the transformation is off the charts. Yeah. Yeah.
So my question is, and you touched a little bit about this in your speech, but what do you envision worship looking like in the future, especially with inclusive communities?
Yeah. The future questions are always hard. I spent the first part of my career, I ran something called Re-Evangelical. I was an evangelical, and was all about let's re-envision what worship looks like. My hunch is traditional worship goes through revival stages. And I think we're about to, in the near future, there will be a desire for people to come back to traditional kind of churches, which is good news for our mainline denominations. I think the fact that you all, I haven't seen your worship yet, but I presume, try to use inclusive language. You try to have inclusive people represented in worship services. I think that's the basic future of worship is Christian worship's not going anywhere, so let's just make it inclusive. Let's make it so that when people show up, they don't get slapped in the face with the toxic theology and toxic language that they're expecting, but they're pleasantly surprised by a community that's intentionally reoriented the way it worships to be inclusive. But the other thing is to understand that the true definition of worship is not Sunday morning. And so to ask, what can you do as a church community? that can invite people into questions about faith, to questions about meaning, to questions about the purpose of life, that doesn't take place by sitting in these seats and watching a church service take place. And I'm sure you all do this in many forms. I know in our community, we tried to figure out different connection points for people to come into contact with our church. So we had yoga classes, we had beer and hymns, we had theology on tap, we had various touch points where we weren't trying to funnel people into a Sunday morning service, but we're saying, come to any of these opportunities we have that meets where you're at on your journey, and you're a part of our church. We, at my former church, we reframed membership altogether, like our process of membership. We got rid of it and said, anybody who commits to show up to any of these things regularly is a member of our church, whether they ever take communion with us, whether they're ever confirmed or baptized. And if you go back to, there's a book that came out recently called Before Jesus, After Christianity, After Jesus, Before Christianity, that explored what the early Christians did. Their communities looked a lot more like that. These were just people living together without formal worship structures that were just trying to invite people into a new way of living in the world. And so I just would always invite Christians to be rethinking what it means to worship beyond the confines of a traditional worship gathering, while also remembering that there will always be people that want ritual and rhythm and this kind of environment. And so it's not give up one, it's embrace it all. And yeah, that's a hard process for a lot of communities, but I think it is the necessary process for the future.
I'm going to ask this question I'm not trying to give a voice to people, but I do know that people are at different places in their journeys. Yeah. And one of the areas I know when I don't know a lot about something is I read. Yes. Are there books that have spoke to you, that you reference often, that really, besides yours, of course, True Inclusion, of course. But are there any books, if you think about even like a resource library and just meeting people where they're at, if that is their preferred way, do you have ones in mind?
Well, that's the good news of the age that we live in, is that on all of these topics, whether it's racial justice, LGBT, disability, socioeconomic stuff, the amount of resources being produced is insane. And if you literally just, I've tried to do lists before on my website for people, and it's very difficult because new resources keep coming out quickly. What I recommend doing is if you go to the major denominational publishing houses, Fortress Press, Westminster John Knox, Orbis Books, Chalice Press, you can Google mainline publishers. Just go on their pages every once in a while and you'll see amazing new resources. I mean, I can't talk enough about Austin Hartke and his book, Transforming, which is the first trans theology from a traditional Christian perspective that I know of, at least in this generation. Such a foundational resource for beginning the journey about LGBT in the Bible. Matthew Vine's God and the Gay Christian is a foundational starting place. Endless amounts of resources. So I'm also happy if you do have or if you want resources on a particular thing, any of you can email me anytime. I love recommending books and series and all of that stuff. So please do that.
Okay, so I have to ask you this question now. Yeah. What are you reading right now?
Well, not much because I just signed a book deal, so I'm writing a lot.
Or listening to or watching on TV.
Yeah, I mean, these are all going to be very off topic. So on the airplane today, I was listening to a book by Marianne Williamson called A Return to Love, one of her first books. Because I'm interested as a pastor in trying to talk about Christianity in ways that are broader than traditional Christianity. Because I think that to be inclusive means that especially for those of us who feel called to ministry, the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts quotes pagan philosophers and pagan poets to talk to the people of Athens. I feel like as somebody who wants to talk about God's love, I want to figure out new ways to talk about God's love. And so I'm always listening to people of different faith journeys and faith paths so Marianne Williamson was today. I read a lot of fiction too, so I'm reading I also have the worst memory. The guy who wrote Call Me By Your Name wrote a follow-up book. Do you all know that book? It's like, yes. So I just started reading, I think it's called like Find Me or something. Great fiction book. Anyways, yeah. I saw a hand over here too. Yeah.
Have you met anyone famous?
Yeah, what does famous mean? What was that?
She said she knew you were going to say that.
Okay. Well, a month ago, or a month and a half ago, I got to be at the White House for the president's signing of the marriage. I forget what it was called now, but it was the LGBT marriage equality bill, and so I got to shake hands with the president, and that was fun. Yeah.
He's famous. All right. Does anyone else have any questions they want to ask Brandan?
Yeah.
Just curious, recently Pope Francis kind of invited his bishops to welcome LGBTQ people into his church. And I don't know if any theology will change, but that seemed to be a progress and maybe breaking down some barriers. I appreciate your thoughts on that.
This is one of my favorite topics because my spiritual director is a guy named Father Jim Martin, who is one of the most prominent Catholic priests in the country right now. And I forget his title, but he's Pope Francis's communications person based in New York City, though, and runs an LGBT Catholic ministry called Outreach. And so when I sit with Father Martin, he's always telling me about these messages the Pope sends him, and he'll show them. The Pope is really personally moving on this stuff. And I'll use this just to talk about our religious denominations in general. There's a real tension here between somebody who controls the largest religious institution in the world with millions of people in countries that have not even begun to have conversations around things like LGBT inclusion. There's a level of discernment of like, I might be here, and what is the pastoral thing to do? If Pope Francis comes out tomorrow and says we're changing the catechism and it's not a sin to be gay, he loses 1 billion Catholics around the world. And is that progress? We don't know. And so I find myself, I've gotten to be privileged to have conversations with denomination leaders from conservative denominations over the past few years. And I get the cry of my LGBT siblings when they see Pope Francis say things like he did a few weeks ago, which is like, it's a sin to be gay, but LGBT people should be loved and accepted and blah, blah, blah. From most other religious leaders, I would say that's unacceptable. But for the Archbishop of Canterbury, for the leaders of denominations that represent people all around the world, it's so complex. We have colonialism we have to think about. We have racial dynamics we have to think about. We have cultural dynamics we have to think about. And so all that to say, for the Catholic Church, I'm hopeful that before Pope Francis retires, which I think he will soon, he will make as much change that is possible within the Catholic Church. And he's already empowered people like Father Jim to really high levels of leadership that are changing global Christianity. It's slow. We're trying to change a 2,000-year institution, all of Christianity, so I just don't think we're going to see a majority of the world's Christians be LGBT inclusive tomorrow. But I do think that we should take heart and be hopeful that from where I sit, the people at the top of most of these institutions are being convicted about these issues, and the change is happening. And so that's why I keep doing the work that I'm doing, because I think it's actually happening, and we will see it in our lifetimes. So, yeah.
The arc of the universe bends towards justice.
Yes. Are you a preacher?
Informally.
Incredible. And I also want to say, I'm really impressed by the inclusiveness of people of different ages, the children in this community. Thanks to all the younger folks for speaking up. That's been really incredible. Thanks for being here, seriously.
Yeah, they're cool kids.
They are.
All right, any last questions before we wrap it up for tonight?
Yeah.
All right. us out.
This might be a little deep for you, deep for all of us, but you're sitting on an airplane.
Uh-oh.
Somebody sits down next to you. Strike up a conversation. Somehow they mention the cliche, hate the sin, love the sinner. Because I hear that a lot as a pastor.
Yeah.
People in the church try to figure out a way to justify their exclusion and their theology and their beliefs. How do you respond to that in a way that's, you could give a response of the theologian in you, right?
Yeah.
But you're looking at another human being in an informal setting. So how do you respond to that kind of language?
Yeah. Wow. Well, first, I'm the guy on the airplane who puts my earbuds in. I'm not talking to anybody. So, introvert. But if that did happen, and it does happen, there's two things. First, this has been the hardest lesson. For the first 5 years of my journey as an out LGBT Christian person speaking publicly, I spent so much time debating. I would go on radio shows with conservatives and sit on stages and debate, and sit down with coffee meetings for pastors and debate. Not one person changed their mind. The theology, frankly, is irrelevant. It's not the thing that's actually keeping people from believing. A broader theology is keeping people from being inclusive, not the 6 clobber passages. It's their entire paradigm of a God that is based in fear. And that's more than I'm going to be able to unpack on an airplane or even at a coffee meeting. And so I think there's a role for allies to say, there are different perspectives on this, and that if it's a good space to go into that conversation, great. But 90% of the time, it's not. The way you're going to change their heart and mind is by saying, if it was you, and I'm sure you would do this, I'm a pastor of an inclusive church. We love Jesus. We're like, I would love for you to come and visit our community sometime. Me as an LGBT person, I would say, if it seems safe, I'm a gay Christian. I've been devoted to Jesus for 20 years. So, we disagree on this, but I just want you to know that, we're brothers and sisters, siblings in the faith. And because it's when people see an LGBT person or an LGBT affirming person living out the Christian faith that you dispel all of the stereotypes they have of us. That's the number one thing that a non-inclusive person fears, is they've heard so much of what it is to be a gay Christian. They expect me to, God knows what, think of all the stereotypes that are out there of a gay person in society, and they throw all of those onto me as a gay Christian. And so when I show up and sit down and I'm just a Christian, normal dude, whatever that means, I just show up as myself, they're like, oh, that's not what I expected. What they are expecting is for us to tell them that they're bigots and say, you're a homophobe and I'm not going to talk to you. I think the challenge of our faith, and this is very unpopular, and I've gotten in trouble on Twitter for saying this kind of stuff, is that we're not called to debate most of the time. We're called to embody love towards our enemies. And in that witness, more times than not, people are going to go back and think about that interaction with that inclusive pastor and be like, he seemed like every other pastor I have ever met, or they seem like every other Christian I know. And those experiences change people's hearts and minds. So it's an exercise in resisting the temptation to jump and debate. I, more than anyone, find myself not following my own advice and diving in and telling people why they're ignorant. But 9 times out of 10, that's just going to make the situation not progress in a good direction. So, yeah.
Well, I'm going to join a celebrity on stage. Just because I want to sit here, right here. We're just going to close out for the evening. I want to thank you all for coming and being part of this conversation and being open and willing to learn along with every other person that is in this room. We're all on this journey together, and I'd like to thank you, Brandon, for being here this evening, and for preemptively for joining us tomorrow. And I'll apologize to anybody if I shamed anyone when I spoke a few weekends ago. Okay, thank you.
Thank you all so much, seriously.